Oh, I didn't see you come in there. Welcome to episode 3 of the What Was Good podcast with Zach and Schuyler. In this episode, we will be discussing the top grossing movie, music album, and book from the year 1958. So stick around to hear more about Rodgers and Hammerstein's South Pacific, the songs from My Fair Lady, sung by the original cast, and the classic tale of Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. We will also be discussing David Lean's cinematic interpretation of Dr. Zhivago as well. If you'd like to get in touch with us to share some thoughts or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. We can be reached by email at whatwasgoodpod@gmail.com and on X, formerly Twitter, at whatwasgoodpod. Now, enjoy the show. Hey everybody, welcome in. We are on episode 3 of What Was Good, so we're happy to have you here with us. Today we're going to be talking about 1958 a little bit.
Ah, yes, I remember 1958 from,
the
last couple of weeks of watching stuff and reading stuff. This even predates me. I know I'm old, but...
Yeah, it was a little different challenge this week, thinking about and watching movies and books and whatnot from before we were alive. It's a little tougher, I thought, but...
At least good. Some of them I'd heard of. Actually, all of them this week I've heard of.
Yeah, they were all pretty recognizable, like especially with our parents being the age they are. They definitely were things that were in our sphere growing up, at least.
Yeah, but before we get to that, it has been a busy week. Of course, trying to finish all these things that we were going to be talking about, but I had a surprise on Friday. Because my sister-in-law and her kids got to our house a day earlier than we were expecting. You know how.
Well, I'm sure it's good to see. I'm sure it's good to see them.
Oh yeah, and it's been great. But you know how it is right before somebody comes over. You're like running around trying to make sure everything's clean and all this stuff. And then like 11 a.m. Friday morning, we've had this on the calendar for Saturday for like months. They're arriving this day. 11 a.m. Friday morning, my wife gets a text that just says "landed."
Huh?
Like, wait a minute, what? And apparently that had been relayed to us at some point via text in the past, but not via email. So when you go back and you search through your emails, there's the reservation. Yeah, Saturday. Okay, we're ready.
Oh, so it was changed.
Yeah, so she changed it and told us. We just forgotten and neglected to change it on the calendar. So it was a bit of a scramble Friday morning, but it's been great having them here. They did not particularly want to watch Dr. Zhivago with me, though.
What's wrong with them?
They're 7 and 10, so nothing is wrong with them.
My wife didn't even particularly want to watch it with me, so I don't blame a 7 and 10-year-old. My kids didn't watch it, that's for sure.
They did have it on while they were in my basement. It's been really, really hot here, so our basement is nice and cool, and my niece and nephew love the basement because it's cool. And there is a kind of insane number of Legos down there. Well, we were getting ready for them to come over. I'm like, I'll organize the Legos so that they could play with them down there. And it took forever. It's a little embarrassing.
Can you ever really organize Legos once you kind of combine them into a mass of all of them together?
Well, you can, I suppose, like if you wanted to sort them all out into the sets, because we still have all the instructions. We saved all the instructions for the sets. But we have like a 27-gallon tub full.
Jeez.
Plus a whole bunch of other smaller tubs. Like, it's a little like shameful. Like, how one person should not be allowed to own this many Legos. They should be seized by the revolutionary state and distributed equally amongst the people.
Everybody gets 1.7 Legos.
Well, I think I have enough for one, maybe about one for every person in my county.
That would be pretty. That would be the worst. Here's your Lego.
Maybe not quite.
Enjoy. Have fun.
Maybe not quite that many.
You have to work together to build your set.
You could try to deliver the sets to each house in the same neighborhood gets a piece of the same set, so they can do a community building thing and come together and build it.
comrade, I'm going to need your top left of the shingles. I don't know.
But yeah, if you ever want to come to my house so we can do a live podcast, feel free to take some Legos home with you.
It's a slow dispersal from here.
Yeah, I hope.
See, this week for me wasn't too bad, but I gave my daughter an assignment to do. Well, no, she asked if she could do it. I don't assign my kids projects that...
Summer school?
Here, do this. No. She wanted to help out our podcast. So she said, hey, could I make you guys draw you a logo that you guys could use? And she actually finished it this afternoon. I actually sent you that picture.
I was going to say, you better have... I'm so glad you said yes to that and not, no, we're good with what we got.
Well, I did make her redo it once, so...
Well, I mean, quality control is important.
Yeah, exactly. So she finished it, and then she was trying to fix something, and it messed up the whole thing. So she gave a big sigh and said, I'll still do a new one. So when this episode releases, you're going to see the new logo that goes along with the podcast now, and it's actually a handmade logo by my daughter that I think is actually pretty good. So it'll be fun to have that up there, and she's going to be very proud to see that on all of the Apple and Spotify and whatever. So that'll be cool.
And we can't afford to pay her yet because this podcast doesn't make any money, but if you send us an email, I'll send you a check. Wait, no, this is getting backwards. But anyway, it definitely will feel good to not have an AI generated logo for our podcast. I was feeling a little bad about that. Like I said, we haven't made any money, so we don't have any money to pay an artist. But that's what kids are for. They do it for free.
That's right. Yeah, and she enjoys doing art, so figured, why not? It's a pretty cool design, I think. Even she came up with it by herself. So
I've seen it. I've seen the preview. It's good. You're gonna like it.
But speaking of sending emails, what if people send us an email? What's gonna happen? What could happen if they give us their address?
I'll tell you what. This happened this last week. One of our listeners, possibly our only listener, don't know, haven't done the analytics, sent an email to whatwasgoodpod@gmail.com with her address, and as of a few days ago, a postcard written by me, handwritten by me, is on the way to her house. So if you want to have a postcard, a unique handwritten postcard from me, Schuyler, just send us an email at whatwasgoodpod@gmail.com, and I'll get on that right away. I've got probably around 400 vintage postcards sitting on my bookshelf, itching to be sent.
And I can confirm that the postcard has arrived to the prescribed listener.
Wow.
So, and it wasn't me. I didn't, or my wife, or anybody at my house. It was someone completely separate. But it has arrived. It's been confirmed.
Completely separate household. We won't get into it.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever. But a postcard has been sent, and if you would like one, just email us at whatwasgoodpod@gmail.com. Oh, and we need your address.
I don't want to derail us here, but I love the United States Postal Service. That's incredible.
Oh.
For 53 cents, I sent something from my neighborhood on one side of the country in less than a week to somebody on the opposite side of the country. I mean, it's like a miracle that you can do it for that cheap.
Quick reference to Dr. Zhivago here. Took 6 months to get a letter in that story. So, a week to get across the country. We're doing pretty good here.
I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Zach's got a bunch of stuff set up for us, I think, to talk about 1958. But I just want to point out that when we came up with this idea for the podcast, we decided to start the year that the very first Grammy Awards happened, which was 1958. So this is the earliest possible year we can get on this podcast. And I need some context.
Yeah, but we really did set this up randomly. Like with the year, we assigned each year a random number, and 1958 just happened to come up second on our list. So it's kind of odd that the earliest one is going to be one of our first ones we do. It's not going to stay that way because I think after this we jumped to 2003, so it's going to be kind of all over the place. But so 1958 was obviously well before our time, but some like what was going on in the world, that kind of helped set the scene with all the things that we're going to be talking about with Dr. Zhivago and My Fair Lady and South Pacific. Some of the stuff that was going on at the time included the space race that was happening between U.S. and Russia, and all the satellites going up. Everybody's heard, well, okay, I can't say everybody, but most people have heard of Sputnik and being the first satellite launched into orbit. That was not the U.S., by the way, of course. The U.S. did launch their first satellite, though, in 1958, and it had its first successful and many failures as well for launching satellites.
I was just at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum yesterday, and they had a bunch of these satellites dangling from the ceiling. I bet one of those was from 1958, or at least a replica.
Yeah, I imagine it was. I doubt they have the original there. That would be weird. But yeah, so that's kind of what was some of the stuff that was going on in the world. Since we're both big baseball fans, we're not going to talk about the Mariners right now.
No, we are not.
A couple major things happened in baseball that year. The first game ever played in California was played in 1958, when the now LA Dodgers were playing the San Francisco Giants. So it's crazy to think that baseball didn't arrive on the West Coast until 1958, but that's absolutely true.
Well, Major League Baseball.
Yeah, Major League Baseball. Yeah, if I didn't specify that. But up until then, it had all been pretty much to St. Louis. That's as far as it had gone. And so it was good to, well, I can't say it was good because I wasn't there, but it was a big change, I'm sure. Now, so many games, so many teams out here, but that's how I prefer it.
Really represents a huge shift. Like the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers both picked up and went to California. Like a big cultural shift for the second half of the 20th century.
Speaking of the New York Giants, that's actually who lost the Super Bowl that year. The football Giants. The New York football Giants lost to, get this, the Baltimore Colts. Not the Indianapolis Colts, the Baltimore Colts. And so that wasn't okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, wait a minute.
Not the Super Bowl, the NFL Championship. It wasn't called the Super Bowl just yet. But they still, to this day, call that game the greatest game ever played because the Colts won 23-17, and it was the first sudden death overtime championship game ever. So, great. Yeah, I don't know much about it, obviously, because that was way long ago, but that's cool.
I've seen the greatest game ever played, and it was the 2014 NFC Championship game between the Seattle Seahawks and the Green Bay Packers, where the Seahawks came back with like a ridiculous series of events in the fourth quarter to win it in overtime. That was the best game ever of my lifetime. Okay, fine.
Well, maybe someday we'll touch on that again, but I said there's a couple baseball things that year also kind of go along with the whole championship thing. That the New York Yankees won the World Series that year for their 18th World Series victory. But anyway, that was, again, before our time, and so I can't hold that against them.
Yeah, fine.
Because they haven't done a whole lot. Okay, yeah, they have. They're still really good, and they're probably going to make the World Series again this year, but that's neither here nor there again.
So, 1958, where were we with all this communism stuff?
Oh, what about it? Communism, so you want it?
I mean, this is post McCarthyism.
Yes.
Post the height of the Red Scare in the U.S., but we're still, I think it'll become clear as we discuss some of these things, extremely anti-Soviet here.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
Very much still at the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, Cold War. I mean, I would look that up. It says technically the Cold War ended in 91, which is weird to me because I don't really associate it with my lifetime so much, but it really was still going on until then.
Yeah, until the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and it's just kind of crazy. But yeah, so 1958, everybody was worried about who was getting ahead in the space race and that the Russians were going to be able to conquer space before us. Well, not that we conquered space or anybody has conquered space, but that was a big fear of for a lot of people here in the U.S.
So
yeah.
What's interesting about that is that takes us to our first topic for the podcast this week, where we're going to be talking about the 1958 movie South Pacific, which from a 1958 perspective is almost nostalgia now, because South Pacific is a World War II set movie. It was the most popular movie of 1958 somehow. It's a musical, a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, by the way, which, just as a quick aside, if Broadway hadn't have taken them, Rodgers and Hammerstein is like an amazing professional wrestling tag team name.
I would love to see them in action.
Yeah, but Broadway got to it first, and so, it'd be too much of a joke, but man, can you imagine?
Man, what would Hammerstein's move be? He'd have his own move, and man, Hammer Time?
It would be the South Pacific, where he just puts the opponent to sleep. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
And I digress.
So South Pacific, like I said, came out in 1958, grossed about, I think, $17.5 million or $15.7 million or something like that. So a lot of money in 1958 dollars.
Yeah, for the time.
Interestingly, it was released as a road show with pre-sold tickets. So instead of doing a wide release like movies do now, it went from town to city with specific dates, and you had to pre-buy your tickets. And maybe that's why it was so popular, why it grossed so much money, because people bought tickets sight unseen. They're like, oh, it's a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical.
Could be. That's
having watched it, I can't explain it any other way.
Yeah, it's crazy to think, obviously internet didn't exist back then, so you couldn't spread the word as easily about these movies or shows, so they couldn't say to each other, hey, maybe don't spend your money on South Pacific, but that's our impression here in 2024, but anyway.
Right. So the movie was directed by Joshua Logan, who also had some interesting thoughts about how the movie turned out. It starred Rossano Barazzi, I think his name was, and Mitzi Gaynor, who I believe is still alive. Also starred John Kerr and Ray Walston, with Juanita Hall as Bloody Mary, one of the most racist caricatures I think I've ever seen in a movie. And the story of this movie, so much as there is one, is loosely based on the book of short stories by James Michener that was published in the late 40s, I believe. So basically, what happens here is we've got some characters on a relatively out-of-the-way island in the South Pacific, in the Pacific Theater of the World War II, circa 1943, so about 15 years before this movie came out. You've got Nellie, who's a nurse on the island. You've got Emile Debec, who's a farmer on the island. You've got Lieutenant Cable, who shows up early in the movie to carry out a secret mission. You've got a bunch of other guys, some Seabees, a bunch of Navy people. So essentially what we have is this island and the Marines thereon are planning and getting ready to do a counteroffensive against the Japanese Navy in World War II. And from there, some things happen. There's a secret mission. There's some falling in love because it's a musical. And that's essentially as much of a story as there is. It's 2.5 hours long, a little bit more, actually. So it's really long.
But we do have to say that there is a built-in intermission in it in the film. It gives you 15 minutes or so to go and get yourself some more popcorn. So that adds to the length of the movie, of course.
Yeah, it does. When the intermission hit, I was like, oh. Or when they were winding down before the intermission, I thought, oh, it must be almost over. There was still like an hour left to go. Yeah.
Yeah, so I started watching this movie, and within about 15 minutes of starting it, I said to myself, I have to look at this as a musical, as a Broadway show almost. It's hard to review this as a movie. I can't really picture it as a movie so much as it is a Broadway musical, and which that's what it was. And so to take this as a movie, it was just really, really hard, and the music in it wasn't even that great for a musical.
Yeah,
but I do want. Oh, go ahead.
I want to push back. Like, some of my favorite movies are musicals. I love them.
Absolutely. That's fine.
And so to say you have to view this as a musical is like, well, no, you can turn a musical into a good movie. They just failed. And so I don't think I even accepted the idea that I had to look at it as a Broadway musical. It's like, no, come on, turn it into a good movie. I'm not an anti-musical guy.
No, I'm not either. I absolutely, there's several musicals that I absolutely love. But what the moment that got me thinking that way was when the sky turned red.
Oh, boy.
Now, okay, are we going to jump right into one of the biggest themes of this movie?
You have to at least describe what you mean when the sky turns red.
Okay, yeah. So it's not like ominous red, like, oh no, the sky is dark and something bad's going to happen. Literally, the entire movie, everything you see on the frame on the screen slowly fades to tinted red or orange or yellow or green or blue throughout the movie. And I my first thought was, I got a bad copy of this. I'm watching it on DVD and I got a bad copy of this and there's something wrong with it. But then it kept happening in different scenes. I was like, oh, this is how they made this movie. They have the color built in to. My impression was they were trying to get you to feel a certain way by making the whole scene a certain color. Yeah, everything else is still going on. You can still see all the characters, but when everything is bright orange, it makes you feel a certain way, of course. And like I said, this got me thinking more like it's a Broadway show, because like in a Broadway show, they can do mood lighting and kind of set the stage and set the scene for like, someone's dead, so now like a red light flashes on. And I felt like that's what they were trying to do in this movie. And that's what made me think, okay, this is more like a play that they tried to turn into a movie and didn't successfully do that.
Yeah, so I did some reading on that because I couldn't believe it when I was watching it. And that is exactly what they were trying to do, right? Like, trying to do like colored lights. And so they're doing these experimental color filters over the lens, thinking, they'd fix it or correct it or make it look great in the post-production. And then that wasn't possible. So instead, and if you haven't seen this movie, there's no way to describe how deep these colors are. Like, Zach described it exactly right, but you just, until you see it, you don't get it. Like, no, it's bright blue. Now, there are a couple of times when it's not like character scenes, when there's some like stock footage or something like that, these colors can be impressionistic and they look kind of cool, but timing the whole scene turning yellow to when the word like the canary yellow sky happens in one of the songs, you're like, oh my god. No,
it was definitely excessive. Oh man. Yeah, I struggled with the movie from the big musical scene, the Bali High musical scene where Bloody Mary's singing about the sacred island that the sailors can't go to. I struggled with it from there because it was so hard for me to focus on what was actually happening when the entire movie is bright orange. So, but my very first note I wrote down, even before anything changed color, is, man, all of those sailors are really skinny. But this was 1958 we're talking about, so
1958 set in 1943, so I think it's probably normal.
Yeah, they were absolutely average back then, but that was just my first impression, like, oh, we're a little different nowadays, unfortunately. But that was my first note I wrote down, even before anything changed to any strange hue of color.
So we may look a little bit different, but I guarantee you, a Bloody Mary character is not going to fly in a movie.
No. I bet someone would try it, but man, yeah, that it was pretty racist. Let's just be honest.
They did actually address that later.
They did, and
so we'll back up a little bit. So Lieutenant.
Yep.
Although Bloody Mary, the character, always calls him Lieutenant Cable, manages eventually to get a boat and sneak off to this mythical island of Bali High, where he meets this beautiful young Asian woman named Liat, who turns out to be Bloody Mary's daughter. They fall in love instantly, which is just a thing that happens in musicals. I don't have
every
a problem
single
with
one of them.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. But he realizes that if he can't stay on Bali High forever, Lieutenant Cable is going to have to take this Asian woman back to the United States with him, and he can't do it. He's too racist. And then Nellie, the nurse who falls in love with Emile Debec, the French plantation owner, finds out that his wife, who died, was a native, an Asian woman. And then she decides, she could never be in love with somebody who was once married to an Asian woman.
A lot of racial undertones, for sure.
Well, they turned it into overtones, like, instantly.
Overtly, yeah.
Yeah, but then to teach the lesson that both Nellie and Lieutenant Cable got over it. They realized, that's stupid. I have to go back. It's okay. I can marry Liat and take her back to the United States. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, in a bizarre scene, Lieutenant Cable gets gunned down by a Japanese airplane while he's on a secret mission on an island to spy on the Japanese Navy. Like, he's suddenly just dead.
And yeah, which we got to point out, he's also with Emile Debec at that point as well, who doesn't die during that. But there's one thing I noticed to go along the whole theme of racism here. There was a song that was sung, I think it was, I don't know what the actual title of the song was, but they were singing about "You've Got to Be Taught," and I can't even remember who sings it now. I watched this like a week ago, but it says something along the lines of, "You've got to be taught to hate a man for his color. Those are things you learn in childhood." And that really made me stop and think, like, okay, so they understand what they're doing, and they're singing about being racist or being taught to be racist. And it just kind of, for me, it shed some light on how things were in that time, and just how different we perceive things nowadays. So that was that was one of the few points in the movie where I felt like, okay, that was insightful and kind of useful and pushed the story on a little bit with what little bit of story there was. I'm still trying to figure out that.
A little heavy-handed, maybe. Sure, not very subtle, but yeah, it was good. They still left Bloody Mary in there the whole time, though.
Yep.
But so I want to go back just like a little bit to what you said about treating it like a Broadway musical. And
okay,
even on that point, it sucks. Like, the songs are boring. There are a couple of songs where, so this is a musical. I like musicals. People like musicals. They have big song and dance numbers. But there are a couple of songs here where the entire song is just in like a close-up of Nellie's face or a close-up of Emile's face while they sing. They don't move. They don't dance. The camera doesn't go anywhere. It's just like close-ups of them singing, and it's the most boring song you can imagine, both visually and musically.
And oddly enough, I can't, other than that one I wrote down, I can't recall any specific songs that were like, okay, I actually really enjoyed that one. There were some that I didn't mind, but there wasn't any that just stood out to me as like, hey, that was a good song for this musical. But it didn't feel right.
Yeah,
in so many ways.
I've seen this movie before, probably 20 plus years ago, and my memory of it was kind of boring. But I was a lot younger, a lot less mature. thought maybe, it's not so bad. I did remember the song, I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair. That was a pretty good one. I still like that one. But my initial impression of seeing it 20-some years ago was right. It's just really dull. And so one of my thoughts was this was filmed with the revolutionary, or at least new, Todd AO camera and film, and maybe just the cameras themselves were extremely heavy, so you couldn't move around. You just had to focus on what you could focus on, and you can't move because we can't move the camera. So maybe there was a technological issue for why it was so static and dull. But
very well could be.
I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that that's why it had to have been, because otherwise Joshua Logan, he needs to go back to directing school, although I think he's been dead for quite some time.
Probably at this point. And I along those same lines, this was kind of in that transition period of movies. There had been plenty of color movies at this point, but it wasn't even until like the early 60s where majority of movies were being made in color. There were still black and white movies coming out during this time too. And so I think that also adds to, hey, let's put all these bright filters on and change the scene to everything being blue. But it just kind of felt like they were trying new things. Like, hey, we're being experimental. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to love this new technology. And but the problem is there's so many other movies from this time that did color or even black and white that was so much better than this.
Yeah, well, you can't fault them for trying.
No, you can't.
Well,
but it's definitely
maybe you can.
It was 1950. Well, you can, I guess, if you really want to get picky. But it felt like, okay, I understand that this was a kind of a transition time in movies, and they were just trying to figure out how to do color correctly and well, even though there had been some movies already at this point that were done in color very well. And
right.
I think we get to talk about some of those next week. But
yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I will say that for my final note, I think it's a really interesting piece of evidence that South Pacific is not one of these 50s and 60s musicals that has had a strong revival, where people are still putting it on in their little neighborhood community theaters, movie remakes. It's not good enough. And I think that's evidence. It's just not interesting enough to keep doing it. So still don't get how this was number one in 1958. Somehow it was.
I think it probably has to do with the pre-sales that you were talking about, getting people, oh, there's a new thing coming to town. We better jump on it and get those tickets. But who knows, because it didn't deserve to be number one. It wasn't nearly as good as so many other things released that year.
So speaking of that, what else was released that year?
You want to talk about that right now? If we got next week where we're going to talk about the Best Picture and nominees in our, or not next week, whenever we get to it. But
I'll just really quick run down the top 10 grossing movies in 1958. Number 1, South Pacific. Number 2 was Anti-Mame, which we'll be talking about next week.
Yeah.
Number 3,
excited for that one.
Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which I've heard of.
Also next one.
Yep. Number 4 was No Time for Sergeants, which is in my mind as a movie that I saw as a kid.
It definitely is.
I know nothing about it except that title.
When you said that name, I instantly went to the library checkout section, and I can remember the little paper that you would have to take to the desk where they would give you the VHS of the movie, and I remember that name. That's so weird. Hadn't thought of that in ages.
We might have to watch that one, even though it was not nominated for anything.
That's
number 5.
We might have to.
Number 5 in 1958 was Gigi, which we will be definitely talking about next week.
Yes.
Number 6 was The Vikings. Number 7, The Young Lions. Number 8, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Number 9, Some Came Running. And number 10, Indiscreet.
Huh. Haven't heard of most of those last 4 there, I don't think.
Yeah, so it kind of makes me think that maybe 1958 wasn't the best year in movies. None of these are stone cold classics.
Yeah, but at least the ones that we're going to be talking about for the Best Picture nominees, those I think some of those are going to be actually pretty good. So
definitely better than South Pacific, I would say.
Yeah. So
because when it comes down to it, I gave South Pacific a D+ for extremely dull.
Dull plus. Not that there's been blowback on my rating of Driving Miss Daisy, but I did give that movie a D. Okay, I was thinking of only comparing it to the movies that we looked at for 1989, so I may or may not have been wrong about that. That's neither here nor there, because as a standalone South Pacific, I also gave a D2 as well. It was just too distracting to have so many things going on and a story that never really developed and characters who I really didn't care about. And the racial overtones that kind of seemed to be pushed a little too much. I just couldn't bring myself to really like the movie in much of any way at all.
So you can't redo your Driving Miss Daisy
rating
because it's canon now. It's podcast canon. But in an alternate universe where you could, where would it be?
I'd probably give that one a C now, just because I still didn't particularly like it, but we're going to watch some movies, I'm sure, that are even much worse, that I'm going to have to reserve that D or maybe even an F for eventually. I hope not, but I know in the long run, Driving Miss Daisy is not going to be one of the worst movies I watch, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Well, that was South Pacific from 1958, and again, if you don't really grasp how obtrusive and annoying these colors are that we talked about, just go watch it yourself.
Yeah, it's a pretty bright movie. That's all we can say. So then should we talk about, well, it's not another movie, but it is the best-selling album of 1958.
It is another musical.
It is another musical, which oddly enough, essentially everything we did for this podcast, this episode, was a movie. And even the best-selling album, the My Fair Lady, with the original Broadway cast, which oddly enough was released in 1956, but it was still the best-selling album in 1958.
It's just that good.
It is. It's for a musical. It is that good. Not okay. That's gonna make me come off as anti-musical, which I am not. But for a musical, I shouldn't have said that. But yeah. So My Fair Lady was the top-selling album of the year, and it's a little weird to call it an album because it's just the songs from the play or the Broadway show, and so. It's not like we think of an album nowadays where you've got separate pieces that are their own standalone thing. These are all just part of the show that they just go along with this show. So it's a different approach, but it's a fun album. It's got a lot of catchy songs to it.
So had you seen My Fair Lady before listening to the album?
No, I listened to the album first, and then I decided, I can't make sense of this album without watching the movie.
Right.
But we have to be careful because we can't review that movie because we have to do that for a later episode.
Right, when we get to 1964, I believe.
Yeah.
I'll say I also found this a kind of hard album to review because My Fair Lady is one of my all-time favorite movies. Absolutely love the movie. Absolutely love the Broadway show. I've seen them both multiple times. So listening to this album just brought so much joy to my heart. Because I know every single song, right? I sing along from the entire time. From Wouldn't It Be Lovely all the way to On the Street Where You Live, which is another one of my favorites. There's just so many bangers, one after the other. But trying to separate myself...
Wait. Hold on. Can you really use bangers to describe a movie, the music from a 1958 show? I don't know if that's the right word to use here.
Did you not listen to Get Me to the Church on Time? That's like the definition of a banger.
Yeah, and you haven't even listed my favorite song yet, but I'll let you continue with your banger approach here.
Well, no, I'm just saying that these songs are very near and dear to my heart. So
yeah, and they're so good.
The only tiny complaint I have, so the movie stars Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn, although it's not Audrey Hepburn singing. The original Broadway cast recording has Rex Harrison in the role of Professor Henry Higgins, but Eliza Doolittle is Julie Andrews, and she's almost too good of a singer, because Eliza starts out as this a gutter snipe, right? A tramp.
Yeah.
They throw out several words for her with a terrible accent. And then you hear Julie Andrews singing, and you're like, she's faking that accent. I can tell. So, obviously, Julie Andrews is a fantastic singer. And after the Wouldn't It Be Loverly song, where you really hear her trying to do an accent that she's just so much better than, after that, I didn't even notice anymore and just was 100% on board because I love the play. I love the movie.
I just now noticed I wrote down the same note essentially twice about how good Julie Andrews was. So my first time I wrote it said Julie Andrews was amazing and makes me want to watch more of her musicals. And then at the end, when I was done watching it, I said, this was really a display for Julie Andrews' skill. At the time, she was only 20 years old.
What?
And it's just crazy. Yes. Like when they recorded this in 1956, she was only 20 years old. And it's crazy because her vocal range is so amazing. And it was just so enjoyable to listen to her sing.
So what was your favorite song then?
Okay, so my favorite song didn't even have Julie Andrews, oddly enough. But my favorite song was, no. It was With a Little Bit, or With a Little Bit of Luck. Sorry,
Yeah.
That's the one.
Okay. Classic, great one. Yep.
Yeah, and just the whole, okay, I don't want to talk about the movie, but the whole scene of what's going on and just the voices and everything, it was just such a fun song about how weaseling out of doing everything, and made sense for who was singing it, with it being her dad singing it. So
what's amazing, especially when you look at South Pacific, it's like every single one of these songs is better than the best of them from South Pacific. And
absolutely, yes, every single one.
I love some Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. I love Oklahoma. Oklahoma is also full of great songs. So I just don't understand, not to take us back too far, but I don't understand why the South Pacific songs stunk. These ones are absolutely fantastic. The one where they're talking about why don't the English teach their children how to speak, it's just it just hits on every level.
I was laughing pretty good because that was the first song on the album essentially, and I hadn't watched the movie yet, and I was just like, what in the world is going on here? It's hilarious, but it's a good intro into what's actually going on in the musical, and it's so much fun.
Yeah, and so I was thinking about this being the most popular album, right, in 1958, and
yeah,
like how ridiculous is that most popular album as a musical soundtrack? And then I realized that might have been true for Hamilton, right?
Ooh, I wonder.
That album was insanely popular, and most of the people that I know that loved it hadn't actually seen the show yet.
Yeah, just the music.
I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Macklemore Does Broadway, which is what Hamilton sounds like to me. But I know a lot of people are, and it's fine. But
yeah.
So I wonder if this is the same kind of thing. There's just some musicals that are so transcendently good that they move outside of the actual media that they're normally in into the greater world.
And I wonder if, since this had existed for several years at this point, before 1958, so it makes me wonder what percentage of the population had seen the Broadway show or an off-Broadway show or whatever, some maybe local production of this, and so they knew about all these songs already, and this was just, oh yeah, I really like that, so it that's probably why it was the top grossing. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, they must have, right?
Yeah.
It must have been extremely popular already. And then just got even bigger when it came to the movie, which, not to spoil anything, but I think it won Best Picture, didn't it?
That's why we can't really talk too much about it, because we got to review it when we get there. That's several episodes away.
Yeah, 1964 is way down the list, but...
Yeah. I mean, that can change at any time. If we have a listener or someone say, hey, why don't you guys do 1964? We could definitely acknowledge that. But we'll see if that ever happens.
Or we could just make an executive decision. Because we want to talk about it.
Yeah, we can definitely do that as well. So one of the things I want to quickly talk about here is not to get too much into the actual show or movie. I'm realizing now, as we're doing this more, so much of all media or music and film and literature is so closely tied to social classes. And I didn't so much realize this before, and I'm sure I have an English teacher rolling over in their grave, although probably most of them aren't dead yet.
Yeah, it's like, I think they're all still alive, aren't they?
Yeah, but they're probably like shouting at me right now saying, this is what we were trying to show you when we had you read The Sisters Makioka or whatever. But it's just looking at so much of these books and movies, especially, but now with this being the music as well, it's like almost everything is tied to social classes and the inequity between the different classes. So I think it's going to be a theme that comes up in almost every episode of our podcast. I have a feeling it's going to, in most episodes at least. So that was just an observation I made.
It's a good observation. It's definitely going to come up in the last part of this podcast.
Yeah, in the next couple minutes, probably. Yeah. So, all right. So if you were to give this one of your favorite musicals of all time as a standalone album, what kind of grade would you be looking at for that?
So I went back and forth. I landed on an A- just because I love it so much. I can't give it an A because, like you said, it's not an album in the sense that we think of them. But I couldn't go lower than an A- because I just get so much joy listening to it.
Okay. So yours is more of a personal grade than a review or critique grade. I guess that's what all reviews and critiques are, is how it affects you personally. So
yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I don't have as close of attachment to this show or movie or anything. Obviously it's existed for me and I've known about it, but I never really sunk much time into My Fair Lady. So I don't know if you'll like it or not, but I'm not doing this because you like it. But as an album, I give it a B, just because it's not what I think of as an album. It's a great group of songs that go with a great show, but it's not an album in my mind. It's, for what it is, it's great. But
I respect that.
Okay. And I'm not here trying to gain your respect about anything either. That's just how I see this, and it's a lot of fun. But it's not an album per se as we perceive things, or, well, as I perceive them to be nowadays, at least.
You may not trying to gain my respect, but you have it.
Well, I mean, we've been essentially together for 40 years, on and off. 41 years. Wait. I'm not saying that because who knows how old I am. Wait, I'm the younger brother here, so all right. With that being said, should we move into... I can't call it Dr. Z because that to me is Dr. Zoidberg from the Futurama series, so I can't call it...
To me,
I can't call it Dr. Z.
It's Dr. Zaius. I went into this book thinking that we were going to read about apes on a planet, maybe even in a musical. Dr. Zaius, Dr. Zaius. Do you remember that song?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was another library VHS checkout that I remember seeing.
And one of the most classic Simpsons episodes of all time, which maybe we'll have to do a review of in a special standalone podcast. Because now I can't get it out of my head.
We're going to have so many extra things that we end up reviewing or forcing ourselves to watch because of just things that remind us as we have these little meetings here.
So give us the lowdown on Dr. Zhivago.
So Dr. Zhivago is set in early 1900s Russia. I think it starts around the first Russian revolt of, I think in 1905 is kind of when it opens up. And then it follows the life of Yuri Andreevich Zhivago, which I think there's other names for him as well, because every character has several names. But it follows his life through the revolution, the First World War, the revolution in Russia afterwards, and all of his life up to around World War II, I believe, is kind of where it finishes off. But it follows him through his loves, his experiences with the war, his experiences as a doctor and poet, and just everything to do with Zhivago, if that's how you know him, because other people know him as something else. And that's kind of where it is. I'll say this. It was originally refused to be published in Russia or the Soviet Union because they didn't want it. They thought it was propaganda. So he had to, the author, Boris Pasternak, I'm probably butchering that. He had to get it published he had a publisher from Italy approach him about publishing the book because he couldn't actually get it published because it was so controversial at the time in Russia. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And Dr. Zhivago is a very, very long book and movie, mind you.
It is pretty long. And so I think we would be remiss not to point out that Pasternak, or however you say his name, immediately won the Nobel Prize for Literature after this was published.
But did he?
He did in 1958, which kind of goes to show how political it was, I would say.
Yeah, it does. But didn't he reject the award because of fear that he would be persecuted in Russia for accepting it?
I believe that's right.
Okay.
And he didn't accept it until later when the book was also published in Russia once it wasn't so counter-revolutionary. It's got to be a political award because this book is just not Nobel Prize worthy. So to be fair, Pasternak got famous in Russia, or was well known in Russia, as a poet.
Yes.
Prior to this, like 30 years before this, around the time of the World War I and Russian Revolution. So perhaps his poems and his early writings are phenomenal. I haven't read any of them.
I did some research into the whole Nobel Prize bit, and it turns out that they were too afraid to give it to him for his earlier works. He had been talked about to get the award from like the 1920s. For like 30 years they had talked about giving the award, and then when Zhivago was actually printed, they're like, okay, now we have to give it to him. So it's not like this was a standalone piece that won him the Nobel Prize. It was for all of his work that kind of accumulated into this prize in 1958. Or wait, yeah, 58, yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Like I don't know that this is the book that deserved to push him over, but
yeah. I'm agreeing with you. I agree with you there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I enjoyed it, right? I particularly enjoyed the first third. I would say for me, this book roughly broke down into two parts. There's the first third, which is pre-World War I.
Two parts, and then you're telling me thirds? I'm confused.
Well, so
here.
The first third is part one, and the second third, or the second two thirds, is a part. In the way I think about it. So the first part is his childhood up to his young adulthood in Moscow, primarily, prior to World War I and the Russian Revolution. And
Got it.
for me, I loved that section. I think it is just full of all of these magical coincidences. So in a lot of ways, it reminds me of, you ever read a book called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez?
I think you asked me that on a different episode, and I still said no to then. So no, I haven't read that one.
Wonderful, wonderful book. One of my top favorites is magical realist. And this is actually what Dr. Zhivago reminded me of in the first third. It's got this way of existing in the past and the present and the future all at the same time. So you see these portents of things to come, right? Well, you're seeing the events happening in the present that are also referenced as these things that were influenced by stuff that happened in the past. It just feels really well done to me, and like a childhood and young adulthood is. And I think that's probably what changed, because he's looking back with rose-colored glasses. I think this is somewhat autobiographical. Looking with these rose-colored glasses on what his younger life was like, and then the brutality and drabness and dismalness of everything after that. And it just kind of lost that magic for me.
Well, but I think that's what Pasternak was trying to get at, like just how brutal living through the revolution was. Before that, things were great. Things were, well, you can't say great, but things were much easier and rose-colored, like you said. And I agree, though. It was, the first section was the most interesting. Like when you said magical, the scene that popped to mind was when he stared at the willow tree and willed it to stop moving in the wind, and it did. And that, like, I mean, who knows if that would have something like that actually would have happened, but that's just in his mind. Was how powerful he was when he was young, and like how great life was, is he was in control of things, and life was working out in his favor, other than the scene starting with his mom dying. But the whole book.
It's really just a wonderful glimpse into the way that children think.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. For me, the scene that really sealed it and got me, I was so pumped to read the rest of it, was the scene where Dr. Zhivago is walking through Moscow to go home after something and sees a single candle lit in a window. And we've already known, in the previous scene, we already saw that single candle was coming from Larissa's room with Pasha, with her husband. And just these two like ships passing in the night. You're like, this is going to mean something. And of course it does.
It really does, yeah.
That magical kind of paths crossing coincidence, which super enjoyed in the first half. And then I feel like Pasternak beats to death in the second part.
Yeah,
where
and
everything.
Oh, go ahead.
Everything becomes a coincidence. After the first third of the book, I don't think there's any new characters introduced, hardly. It's just the same few characters continuing to have these magical coincidences crossing paths. And so the first few times, like, oh, that's cool. Like, I get it. I see what they're doing. And then it just gets so old and kind of dumb. Like, the world is so much bigger than that, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing I walked away from this with, is how small everything became, and how so centric this was. I mean, obviously this is a story about Dr. Zhivago, but everything just kind of always working in a way that always centers around him, and like running into relations thousands of miles away from where you know them, or someone recognizing someone. Oh, I can tell by your face that you are related to are you related to Antipova or whatever. And it's just like it's so tightly refined with who is in the story and what their relationships are. Like, one of my notes was that this whole book is all about relations. Like, who do you know? Who are you related? Like, who is your family? And if you have the right ones, then things will work out. If you don't, then sorry, you're probably going to end up dead in a field like all the young military students. So it felt like it really shrunk. Yeah, that was a kind of rough scene. But
that was brutal.
Yeah. I felt like it shrunk down to being just a few, like you said, just a few people, but in many different locations, but still the exact same people.
Right. And it just got that just got old for me. And you know what? I'm on good footing here because Vladimir Nabokov, the famous Nobel Prize winning author himself, had the same comment.
Oh, well.
It was just
then you must be right, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with other people actually really love this book, so I'm not going to pay attention to them. And so that's not fair. I did enjoy this book. I just thought that the smallness of that second half and the continuous ridiculous coincidences, they lost their magic and became de rigueur, or like Pasternak was thinking, better put in another one of these because that's one of my themes, the coincidences of life. And I'm like, all right, we get it.
Yeah, but life can't only be coincidences. That's we can't have that. Yeah, so I mean, I enjoyed the book. There was the characters; they were, I mean, described and detailed to a T. But I don't know if I liked the book. I enjoyed reading it. Well, I got to be honest here. I read about the first third, and then I had to listen to the audiobook for the second or the last 2/3 just because to save on myself some time. But
yeah, fair.
Yeah, and because it is such a long one, and the movie itself was almost as long as the book. But I don't know if I actually liked the book. I don't know. I'm kind of all over the place with this one.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question.
Okay, Matt might help me focus down.
That I feel like I had in my head about this before ever having seen the movie or read the book is that it was some kind of epic love story.
That's kind of how... Okay.
What did you feel about the relationships that Yuri Andreevich had with Tanya Alexandrovna?
Oh, you're going to go all for...
Larisa Fyodorovna, and apparently somebody named Marina at the end.
Yes, I remember her. So I kind of had that impression about this book as well, that it was an epic love story. And actually, I think that's what was written on the cover of the DVD as well, an epic love story. So maybe that's where I got the impression that that's what this was. I didn't get that from, honestly, the book or the movie. It seemed like it was just somewhat of a love story set in revolutionary Russia, or not even so much a love story as it is just, hey, here's what these people went through as they were together at the time. So not really love.
There's a famous song that says, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. And that feels like exactly what this story was about. He loved Tanya, and I do believe that their marriage and relationship was deeply loving and everything. It was portrayed that way. He was so excited to see her again after 2 years on the front when they reunited in Moscow. But while she wasn't around, hey, there's Lara. And Lara goes away at the end to escape death because she was the wife, not even divorced, of the revolutionary leader Strelnikov, a.k.a. Antipov, Pasha Antipov. And so Lara's gone, and he's like, I'm back in Moscow. Here's this girl that washes my clothes. Now I'm in love with her. And so it really took a lot away from this idea of an epic love story when the main character just falls in love with whatever woman he's with.
Yeah, and I really could have done without the last... I mean, it was only the last couple chapters of the book that he had this other lover, and I think Marina was her name.
Yeah, I think
whatever
so.
It was. It's like okay, well, we'll get to that when we talk about the movie a little bit. But this didn't, like you said, this didn't really feel like a love story. It just felt like Zhivago. Oh, wait. Oh, I wrote down the perfect comment for this. Not so much about necessarily the whole love story scene or the whole idea of this being a love story, but one of my takeaways from this is that Dr. Zhivago, or Yuri Andreevich, was an utterly unimpressive individual. There was nothing incredibly special about him, the women he loved, or the work he did, or the choices he made. He was kind of a coward a little bit. That was kind of my take, is he would run away from problems that he perceived to have, but they weren't always real problems. So just in my take was like, this guy wasn't really that great a person. I know it played on the whole idea of him being a poet and everybody loving his poetry, but that didn't seem like a huge theme throughout the book, that he was a beloved poet, because a lot of in the story was that people weren't supposed to be reading his poems because it was revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, I guess, at the time, and people weren't supposed to be reading what he wrote. But I just kind of got this impression that he wasn't an impressive individual, and just doesn't make for a great story.
Oh, yeah, he's just kind of like a normal guy, although a good doctor, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, he did his job well, but that can be said of a lot of people.
True.
Yeah.
I find the book very much in line with other Russian literature. It's just,
how much Russian literature have you read?
Not a whole lot.
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn, who I think was a contemporary of Pasternak, and who was better at the documentariness of writing about Soviet Russia. It was less. I think it's less personal for him, even though he lived through it as well. He's able. I think the second part of this book, Pasternak was just too close to the actual events to be able to view it with any kind of remove. Whereas Solzhenitsyn was a generation younger, and so his writings about the Soviet state are so, like, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is one of my favorite books of all time.
Ooh,
Love it.
I have read that one, but it's been since high school.
Yeah, it's so good, and it's so matter of fact in a way that this one can't ever get to. Yeah. But I mean, they're different things. They're different kinds of things. But every Russian book I've read is just such a downer. Like, I don't think any of them end happily. Like, this one made me want to pull a Strelnikov.
But there's only a few people that would get that. So,
if you want to understand what that means, read the book or watch the movie, I suppose.
Yeah, well, they cover that in the movie as well.
Yeah, it's not good.
I did a little research about Pasternak, and obviously, but so his family was definitely more of one of the elitist kind of the upper class family.
Not surprised.
Yeah, I mean, so like his family they were friends with Tolstoy and Rachmaninoff. They would have I read something that Pasternak remembers them coming over to his house and Rachmaninoff playing music for them as they all sat in the living room and listened. So it's it's interesting to hear his take on this, being from that kind of background, and then to write this book, which is obviously related, but so it's just kind of interesting that he would write the way he did with the family that he came from. That was just a take I had.
I feel like you definitely feel the upper classness of this book. Respectful of the revolutionaries, but not really. Thinking that they were in the wrong.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I feel like sometimes I have a hard time picturing what I'm reading. So I think in the movie they portrayed that really well, especially in the beginning where they would show all of the rich families or the elite class and how they were dealing with things. So it was easier to see it in the movie than it was to try to picture everything that was happening, because I don't have a whole lot of frame of reference for the revolutionary Russia
I'm excited to talk about the movie, but we should probably wrap this up first. The only other thing I wanted to note is that I read this book on Kindle. I also listened to some on audiobook, depending, because I wanted to use my time wisely while I'm driving to work or, mowing the lawn. I was listening, but reading it on Kindle, and they had all these footnotes, which were extremely useful.
Oh, that would have been nice.
Give me information. I'm like, I don't know what he's talking about here. Oh, it's a battle between Japan and Russia in 1903.
The Russo-Japanese War?
Yeah. And a bunch of things like that, telling me who this Bloch poet was, like that he referenced a couple of times. What made me laugh was that there were some other footnotes to these references to obscure Old Testament stories. And I'm like, who needs a footnote for that? Doesn't everybody know that? And I realized, oh, you know what?
Probably not.
A lot of people probably don't. When the Naaman and the guy whose donkey starts talking. I'm like, yeah, everybody knows that. Come on. You don't need a footnote to explain to me this. But no, maybe you do. Maybe not everybody went to so many classes as a kid as I did.
Yeah, we had, looking back, maybe a unique upbringing. Not in a bad way. Yeah,
it definitely helped me with this book. There's a lot of references that I get that I didn't need the footnotes for, and I'm proud to say.
Yeah, I didn't have footnotes, so there's maybe some that I probably wouldn't have needed, but most of them I still would. All right. So I'm going to give you my grade for this.
I'd love to hear it.
So I went with the exact same grade I went with My Fair Lady. I gave it a B, just because it's a good book. It didn't jump out at me as being worthy of Nobel Prize necessarily, but I don't know what other literature has won Nobel Prize awards. It was enjoyable. It got a little long-winded at times, and like you said, there was just too much of the same. Even though it was set in an interesting time, and there's an interesting story about what all was going on around Dr. Zhivago, I just didn't feel like it was an outstanding work. That's my take.
All right. I gave it a solid B.
Okay.
I highly enjoyed that first third before the war, so much that I was highlighting things like mad on the Kindle. Like, oh, this is this is a top 10 book. And then it started to go downhill and dragged and ended up for me at a B.
Okay.
It's a long read, but I think worth it if you want to go into it.
Yeah, and it's one of those books that you're not going to pick up and read again anytime soon, but it's one of those books that you also should probably read if you want to understand what was happening in that time period. I feel like that's probably a good choice.
I will give you a little bit insight there. We're going to be talking about the Dr. Zhivago movie, which came out in 1965 right now. And earlier today, I called our parents.
Oh?
Because one of the things that I remember as a kid, one of the reasons that Dr. Zhivago has ever been in my head, was that I remember them talking about liking it.
I remember that as well, yes.
And I wanted to verify this memory. And I did.
For me, it was, I remember our mom being the one who fondly remembered this movie or book.
Both, actually. She reread the book recently, so you say that it's not worth rereading? Well, I think that our mother would disagree with you there. But I found out that our parents saw Dr. Zhivago in Southern California as a double feature with Paint Your Wagon at a 49-cent movie theater. So this is probably 1970 or so.
Yeah.
So that's like 6 hours of movies for 49 cents.
And probably 2 separate intermissions, or 3 if you count the space between the movies.
Right. So that is an incredible deal in terms of movies per dollar.
Okay, wait. Along those lines, I happened to look up what movies cost throughout the years. And in 1958, the average cost of a movie for people to go see was, I believe the number was 48 cents or 47 cents. So that's what it costs to go see a movie. If you wanted to go see 1950 or South Pacific, you would have had to pay 47 cents or so to get to go see it. So they were right in track with that. Yeah, nowadays, but you don't want to know what the modern one is. But anyway.
So let's talk about this beloved movie of our parents, 1965's Dr. Zhivago, directed by David Lean, starring Omar Sharif, I think.
Yep.
And
that was
Alec
his name.
Guinness. And I forgot to write down who played Laura.
Laura was Julie Christie. So it's interesting, and I didn't realize it as I was watching the movie, but his brother is Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, right? Alec Guinness. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then just like when I saw his name in the credits, I was like, wait a minute. I know him from something else.
Well, this is on the tail end of Alec Guinness's absolute terror with David Lean.
Oh, okay.
David Lean directed Bridge on the River Kwai, starring Alec Guinness.
Can't wait to do that one.
One of the greatest movies of all time.
Yeah.
Followed that up with Lawrence of Arabia, also one of the greatest movies of all time, starring Alec Guinness, and then ended that streak of 3 movies with Dr. Zhivago. And I'm like, what an incredible run for those two, that director-actor pairing.
Yeah, that is quite the set of 3 there, man.
Because I'll say, I like this movie.
I had never thought about that.
I like this movie better than the book.
I did too. Because
and I think a lot of that Oh, go ahead.
It didn't play off as much of a slog. I know the movie itself is over 3 hours long, but it didn't feel like it was hitting at the same thing so much. And I think they took some liberties with doing that a little bit differently for the movie. So, but go ahead. I interrupted.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think a lot of that, what I loved about it is the direction. I think David Lean knows how to create a shot, like these enormous vistas of the mountains and of the plains, and the way that he lights, or the lighting guys light, in particular Laura and Dr. Zhivago together, where you've got her eyes highlighted, he's in darkness, really extremely effective dramatic shots. Like, it just is a beautiful film.
I think you stole my notes. Like, everything you just said there is like some of the main things I wrote down. Just like the lighting. I compared it to South Pacific, of course. Like the lighting choices between South Pacific and Dr. Zhivago. Mind you, they're 7 years apart. But just, I love the scenes, like how, as like you said, the eyes just being illuminated. Laura's eyes in this movie, I felt like were almost as big of a character as many others. Just her eyes by themselves were enough of a character that it conveyed a lot of emotion just looking at her. So yeah, but the lighting definitely played a huge part in that.
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic, and the exaggerated frozenness of a lot of the scenes, especially toward the end, as their life together is ending and kind of dying. Just these brutal frozen tundras and the frozen house where they're trying to scrape out a little bit of a life together. Just the symbolic visuals paired really well with the story. Although the story, I think, was a little bit more efficient than the book. It didn't
include as much, and I think that helped.
It did include some of my favorite scenes. The one, just like little things, like the candle scene in the window.
The candle, yep.
That
I knew
was
you were
there.
going to mention that.
The scene where the mare is pulling the sleigh while her foal is dancing alongside. And
I love that.
That was also in the movie. Beautiful scene. The scene where Tverson, I think it is, or one of the guys, is trying to stop the revolutionaries and gets up on a barrel of water and then falls in, and one of the guys shoots him. Like, word for word, straight from the book, and just wonderfully done in the movie as well.
Yeah, and that scene, I wasn't expecting that scene in the movie, but as soon as he stood up on the barrel and said, "Oh, I know exactly what part we're at in the book and where we are," and then it looked like, I think in the book he was accidentally shot, wasn't he? Or I don't know if it was on purpose. It
was a little questionable.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, there was a lot of scenes where I was like, I know exactly what's happening here because it is taken directly from the book. But there's a lot of other scenes, like the whole arc of him being taken by the partisans into the forest. That was a very small section of the movie, actually. And it was essentially a third of the book almost was him being with the partisans and being essentially kind of a hostage or being forced to serve with them. But yeah,
frankly, I'm glad they cut a lot of that.
That's the part that you weren't crazy about anyway. Yeah. I'm with you on, like, one of my notes here was it's described as a romantic epic, but the movie made it more of a visual epic because there was so many amazing scenes. Like, who cares what was happening in the train car? Well, okay, that was important, but going over the Urals and just the scenes of them in the train, or what was going on around them, going through the mountains and then going through the burned down villages, it was just amazing, and it was really enjoyable to watch because of how well produced the film was.
Yeah. The one thing I wish they would have included is the lovely scene where the train has to stop while they're going from Moscow to the Urals because it's snowed in. And all of the passengers get out and work for several days in the healthful sunlight, winter sunlight, and shoveling it out and working together. I like that scene happy in the book. Yeah, everybody's happy. I was a little disappointed to not see it in the movie, but that the trip from Moscow, where they're escaping Moscow to go down to Varakino for the first time. I feel like they kept going back to Varakino and Yuriatin and over. But as you exit the intermission, the on track song fades to black, and you just see this black screen, and then
I was so confused.
Slowly, this dot of light appears and gets bigger and bigger, and then finally you realize you're on the train looking out at the end of the tunnel as you've reached the other side of the Urals, and I thought that was just so brilliantly done.
Yeah, and
I was right back on board.
Yeah, that's how they would have felt in the story as well. It's like, oh, we're finally passing through to where we need to be. And so, yeah, that visual, I was confused though. Like when they came back and there was like no sound and everything's black, I was like, wait, what's going on here? And then whoop, you see it show up, and like, that was really good. There was a couple scenes that I thought would be in the movie. Like you said, the one that got me was a different train scene. For some reason, it was stuck in my mind from the book where the guy jumped off the train and committed suicide.
Oh, right at the very beginning, yeah.
Yeah, way back at the beginning, because his lawyer had convinced him to. And I felt like that was a pretty monumental moment in Yuri's life. But, yeah, it wasn't included in the movie, so that's okay. There wasn't much of his childhood in the movie at all, which I guess makes sense, but it was more about his adult life in the actual movie.
I did really like the connection to his past and his childhood that the red balalaika represented in the movie.
Yeah, and they followed him all throughout.
I don't think that was in the book.
No, it wasn't. But they didn't make a huge deal of it. They just kept showing it kind of, and every once in a while referring to it in the movie, especially right at the end.
Right. It was just this nice rootedness that you had in his past and where he'd come from and his connection to his mother and everything. I thought that was really well done visually. I gotta say, David Lean rules. I think, to use the parlance of our times, he's got the Riz.
Okay, I'm not going to argue with it there, especially when we get to watch more of his movies before long here.
Yeah, there's just some directors that have it. I think Spielberg is one. Some people don't agree, but I love his movies. I was watching The Post not very long ago. I didn't even know that was a Spielberg movie, and like 5 minutes in, I'm like, wait a minute. Did Spielberg direct this? Because it just has that style, distinctive style, and I think David Lean is one of those, and I'm so glad that I watched this movie.
Yeah, I know we're going to be watching more of his movies like Bridge Over the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. It makes me want to go see what else is out there and see if I want to watch any more of his work. I'm sure I will, but
I bet your local library has those DVDs in stock.
They might, and if they don't, they'll get them for me.
Well, I feel like I've kind of telegraphed where I am on this movie.
Oh, have you? Well, I mean, obviously you like it.
I think this is... I'm going to go with a high A minus. I've gone back and forth since I finished it, whether it's an A or an A minus, and I think it's a high A minus, just missing that A, which I'll reserve for the very best of the best.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. So better than the book.
It is an epic in all senses of the word, and I love that.
Yeah. I went a little lower than you did. I gave it a B plus. I mean, it's still very, very good. It's always so hard. Well, okay, I can't say always because we've only done this a couple times now, but it's a challenge for me to read the book and have all the details of everything that's supposed or could happen in the movie, and then to watch the movie, which in itself it's a separate thing, but it doesn't always encompass the book. And I don't think this one needed to, really, because there's too much in the book that doesn't really require covering, but it's just hard for me to rate this really high. For movies based on books, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to rate the movie as high as I would the book, or as high as I feel like it could be.
That's fair.
So I did rate the movie actually higher than the book, but I felt like it could have been, if it had included the whole story of the book, it probably would have been an A, just because the visuals in this are so striking that alone, for me, was enough to get it a B plus.
I wonder how I would have felt about the movie had I not just read the book.
I wonder that too.
Because some of these scenes that I absolutely loved were pulled straight from the book, but kind of context-free in the movie. So they didn't come with all the context. And without the book, I may have not even noticed and liked it less. Who knows?
That's true. So, yeah, it's always going to sway your opinion one way or the other. So, but that's why there's these other movies too, like the Best Picture and stuff that we get a review. Not necessarily, although I know some of them are based on books or plays, but we're going to get to review some things that are their own standalone thing that they build their own context without having to have a book to do it.
Yeah, so this was a heck of a week, I gotta say.
This was a big... it felt heavy to me. That's just the best way to put it, I think.
And we're back in 1958 for our next episode.
But somehow it feels like it's going to be a lighter episode, though.
Yeah, so this week, this episode, we covered our top-grossing book, movie, and album of 1958, and next time we're going to talk about the award winners from 1958.
Yeah, and we will again be looking at all the nominees for Best Picture. I hope there's one that I need to find access to, but the rest of them I have access to, and I'm excited to watch them, though, especially Gigi. That's the actual award winner, but it'll be fun to see if we think that one should have won the award again, or if we think one of those other 4 nominations actually should have won it, like we did for 1989.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any of these 5 movies.
Me neither.
That were nominated. So like you said, Gigi was the Best Picture award winner. The other nominees that we'll be discussing on our next episode are Anti-Mame, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Defiant Ones, and Separate Tables. None of which I have seen, a couple of which I've heard of.
So 3 of those other 2, obviously, Gigi, Anti-Mame, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, those were also some of the ones that were the top grossing, weren't they? They were in that list of 10 you gave us?
Yep.
Yeah. So they were not only popular, but also well acclaimed as well. So
we'll see if they can redeem 1958 on the movie, on the film front.
Yeah, we'll see. Because, Dr. Zhivago wasn't a 1958 movie. That was much later. But it ran into some powerhouses in the year it was released that kept it from winning any
Another Julie Andrews musical, I believe.
Hey, you might be right.
So other than those 5 movies, I think next episode we'll also be talking about another kind of strange album. The very first Grammy Award winner for Best Album. Music from the TV show Peter Gunn by Henry Mancini.
Honestly, I've already listened to this. It's totally different than anything I've thought to experience before.
Wow, I am looking forward to this conversation.
Well, just thinking about like reviewing or like as for our podcast, I feel like this is going to be a very unique album to talk about, and I'm excited for it because not only is it the top or the award winner, the Grammy Award winner, very first Grammy Award winner for Best Album, it was actually also the top grossing for 1959. So
I did not realize that.
I didn't either until I looked at the spreadsheet and I was like, oh, hey, wait a minute.
It also leads off with a song that I've played many, many times in the high school pep band.
I instantly knew it as soon as it came on. I started humming along with it.
But we'll save it for the next episode of this pod. The last thing we'll talk about next time is the National Book Award winner for fiction in 1958, The Wapshot Chronicle by John Cheever. Never heard of it, but I've got it on my Kindle now.
Yep, I've got it on hold at the library. So I'm excited
so we'll be getting to those next
one.
Time.
Yeah. And hopefully next time when we come back, we'll have positive things to say about the Mariners.
Oh, we can only,
that's for next time.
Hope.
We can only hope. And
maybe next time we'll go a little bit shorter than we did tonight. We just have a lot to say. There's a lot of meat to dig into there with Dr. Zhivago and Bloody Mary from South Pacific.
Yeah, there was plenty for sure. And I think, like I said, though, I think next episode is going to be a lighter episode that's more fun and entertaining, I think.
Yeah, and if you're going to join us from this episode on one of the things that we covered, I would recommend the Dr. Zhivago movie. Long, but fantastic.
Yeah, I think that was the best thing we did this week. All right. Well, I think that wraps things up.
Until next time?
Until next time.
Okay. I'm Schuyler.
Yeah, and I'm Zach. And don't forget, if you want to get a hold of us, whatwasgoodpod@gmail.com or whatwasgoodpod on X.
Formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, that's the one. And we will see you next time around.
Bye.